Hello and welcome to the Key Stage 2 Maths Parent Workshop. I'm going to be explaining what the maths curriculum looks like in Key Stage 2 and also helping you understand how you might be able to help your child. I'm going to be going through the end of Key Stage expectations and looking at the Year 3, 4, 5 and 6 overviews for teaching maths. We'll also be looking at the calculation policy for Key Stage 2 and how parents and carers can support their child at home. The National Curriculum Programme of Study clearly explains the expectations for pupils at the end of Key Stage 2. And if you use the blue link, it will take you straight to the National Curriculum. The key areas that we need to focus on are knowing all the times tables fluently in any order. At the end of Year 4, in June, Year 4 sit a times tables maths test. And during that test, they need to know all of their times tables. So the expectation is that by the end of Year 4, all of the children know their times tables. The children need to be able to understand how to use the 4 operations: addition, subtraction, multiplication and division, and the inverses to calculate arithmetic questions and solve word problems. The children also need to be able to understand how maths relates to all aspects of our lives and being able to solve real-life maths problems, including involving metric units and comparing imperial to metric measures. I'm going to take you through the overviews for each of the different year groups so that you can see how the learning progresses. In every year group, we start with place value. Now, those numbers get larger according to which year group your child is in. So in the autumn Year 3 overview, we start with Unit 1, which is place value within 1,000. Move on to Unit 2, which is addition and subtraction, and Unit 3 continued. So the children will be working on arithmetic and also problem solving. Then they move on to multiplication and division too. So those are the big areas for the autumn term in Year 3. In spring, they continue learning about multiplication and division and use the expanded written method for multiplication. They also learn how to divide 2 digits by 1 digit. And later, when I talk about the calculation policy, I'll show you the different ways that we teach multiplication and division. They move on to learning about measurement, and it's important that they do that as practically as possible. So using rulers, using tape measures, understanding what different units of measure are and how they're used in real life. They move on to learning about fractions of quantities, and mass and weight. And again, if you're working in the kitchen, maybe with your child at home, show them how much different items weigh and measure. And then the last unit of measurement is capacity. So working out how much a container can hold. And that's another thing that can be done very easily in the kitchen with your child. In the summer term, there's some consolidation of the learning about fractions, and then the children move on to learning about money. Again, another area where parents can support at home is to by showing children money, using change. I know we don't use that so often in shops now, but you can show them how much something costs and how much change they might get from a certain amount of money. Unit 13 is time. Again, this is an area that needs a lot of repetition, and children do find it difficult to get that concept of time. You can talk about how long it takes to get to school, what is the time now, what time will it be in half an hour, etc. Unit 14, angles and properties of shapes, and then Unit 15, statistics, which means looking at interpreting and drawing pictograms, bar charts, and collecting and representing data using simple two-way tables. So you can see that having looked at Key Stage 1, all of those topics are very similar. We're just moving that learning on to understand more complex aspects of maths. In Year 4, the most crucial piece of information that you need to know is that they must all know their times tables this year. Practice every day is crucial, and times tables rock stars can be used to do this. So please make sure the children are doing this every single night, because the times table test they sit will be online, and therefore they need to know their times tables fluently and in any order. Again, we start with place value, looking at 4-digit numbers, and that's unit 1 and 2. We move on to addition and subtraction, and then we look at measure and area. So you can see the topics are exactly the same, but they're just moving that learning on. Unit 5, multiplication and division. So the children, having got a strong grounding in year 3 and Key Stage 2, should be able to progress their learning even further in year 4. In spring in year 4, we continue with multiplication and division, and then move on to measure and fractions and decimals. Now, fractions and decimals is quite a tricky topic and topic area. So again, that's repeated several times in year 5 and year 6 as well. In the summer, the children are continuing to understand decimals and fractions, and then moving on to money and time, which, as you saw before, we'd already looked at in year 3, and then we're looking at again in year 4 to give the children that understanding. They need lots of repetition. Then we move on to geometry, statistics, and another unit on geometry, position and direction. So all of these topics will be revisited in year 5 and 6 as well. Again, in year 5, you can see in the autumn, we start with place value, but we're looking at place value within 100,000 and then place value within 1 million. Then the children are learning about addition and subtraction, multiplication and division, and fractions. So again, you can see those topics are repeated, but when you look closer at the objectives, the learning is getting a little bit more complex. In spring, we're looking at multiplication and division and fractions again, and moving on to decimals and percentages. So having got a strong grounding in decimals in the previous term, they're looking at percentages. Then we're looking at measure and graphs and tables. So you can see again, the topics are being revisited so the children have plenty of time for overlearning and repetition. In the summer term, they're looking at geometry, properties of shapes, and position and direction. Then we come back to decimals again. So you can see that having looked at decimals and learned about decimals in the spring term, they're again overlearning that in the summer. They then have a unit on negative numbers. It's really important to relate that to real life. So for example, looking at temperatures, looking at temperature gauges, measure volume and capacity. So they're looking at how much an object can contain, looking at 3D shapes. And then finally, the year 6 overview. Now, what I would say is that most of the learning for year 6 has already happened in year 3, 4, and 5. So if your child has got a solid grounding of maths by now, they're overlearning all of those topics. And then again, understanding a few additional topics for the end of year 6. In May, year 6 sits the end of Key Stage 2 exams, and they will have learned everything that they need to know in order to take those tests. Unit 1, again, number and place value. And in the red, you can see the arithmetic questions that are taught alongside the learning as well. Then they need to perfect their 4 operations, their addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And then they're moving on to fractions. You can see here, we've got decimals and percentages again, which they learned about in year 5. We've got some other topics in autumn, measurements, and they need to be able to convert between miles and kilometers. So using imperial measurements as well as metric. In the spring term, they're learning about ratio and proportion and algebra. So you can see there, those are 2 new topics for spring in year 6. However, decimals, percentages, and geometry and statistics are all topics that the children have learned before. Again, it's really, really important that the children are not just putting a lot of effort into year 6. It's important that the children are working very hard all the way through year 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in order for them to have the information that they need for the end of the key stage. And then finishing off with unit 14, geometry, position and direction. Now in year 6, because we are working towards the tests as well as giving the children a really good maths education, we have to be mindful that some of the topics covered, the children may not be secure on. So some of the order of the way we teach may change. we might spend more time on one topic than another in order to give the children the best possible chance of doing well in their end of year tests. And then in the summer term, the beginning of the summer term, they have a revision period and time to teach any topics that were not covered in the spring term. The standard assessment tests take place in May, and the Unit 16, the problem solving involving all the skills taught across this year, and Key Stage 2. So I'm coming to the calculation policy, which I'm just going to talk about briefly. And this will be emailed to you along with the link to the video as well, so that you'll be able to see how your child is being taught. The CPA approach is the concrete, pictorial, and then the abstract approach. So first of all, we have the concrete approach, where the children are using manipulatives and they're using real-life practical resources to understand concepts. Then we move to the pictorial part, which is where the children might be drawing diagrams, thinking about how that might look in real life. And to be honest, every year group, including Year 6, should be drawing out any word problems and making sure that they understand what is being asked from them. And then we're looking at the abstract part, which is representing the concrete and pictorial, which the children have already understood in number terms. So it might be using a number line or a number track. When we're looking at understanding place value to 1,000, we might be looking at using hundreds, tens and ones to build 3-digit numbers, and then using Dean's equipment to represent numbers to 1,000. And then when we're looking at the abstract, we're looking at the part-whole model, which I'm sure you will have seen in your children's books. Adding 100, we're looking at 100 concrete items to start with. Then we're looking at the pictorial, we're looking at making a design or a picture of what we see. And then we're looking at the abstract. So we're looking at numbers here and seeing how those work together. For example, using number bonds to add the ones, we can actually use physical objects to do that. Then we're using our Dean's apparatus to help us understand what that looks like in a place value table. And then we might be using a number line to understand the link with counting on. So these are the different methods that you may see your child being able to use, and also having a look at these makes us more able to understand how they're working in class. We rely heavily on using a bar model as well. So for example, 275 add to 99 is 374. We can also use the inverse as well if we're looking for a missing number. If we want to know which two numbers make up 374, we can use our missing number there and use subtraction take away. If we're subtracting hundreds, we might want to use a number line. And then if we're adding, we may want to do that using our part-whole model. Moving on to learning about column subtraction to calculate accurately and efficiently. In lower key stage 2, the children need to understand how the times table facts relate to commutativity. So that means it doesn't matter which order the multiplication is done in. 6 times 4 is 24, and it's exactly the same as 4 times 6. And we use arrays to do this. So a number of counters put into the 6 times and 4 times tables. We also need to know our known times table so that we can calculate divisions. So if we need to work out 30 shared by 5, we know that the inverse is 5 times 6. So again, we might be using a bar model to represent the relationship between sharing and grouping. In upper key stage 2, here are some key methods that are taught using the calculation policy. So again, we use our bar models, and we encourage the children to use this all the way up to year 6 so that they can look at and understand what the calculations look like. We might use approximation to check whether answers are reasonable. So rounding is really important. The children need to be able to round to 1,000 here in order to check their answer. Does it seem reasonable? We also use our column subtraction methods with exchange when required. And again, we're using our bar models again, particularly in problem solving, because that's a really, really good visual way for the children to see what is required. If we're subtracting two large numbers that are close together, children can find the difference by counting on. And then they also need to be able to use known facts and unitizing to multiply. So if we know what 5 times 4 is, we can work out what 5 times 40 or 400 or 4,000 is. So again, that's another way of the children understanding their calculation skills. I thought it might be useful to show you how we teach short division. We can use that up to 4-digit numbers. And then we also use long division too. So there are some 2 key methods that can be taught using the calculation policy. It's really important to support your child with their maths learning as far as you can at home. So for example, that might mean making sure that they have quiet space in order to do their times tables rock stars. If you don't have access to the internet, please do let us know. You can also test them on their tables on the way to school if you're walking or in the car. It's a really good way of doing that. If you're weighing and measuring in the kitchen, get the children to understand how much you need for a particular cooking item. All the information shared in this session will be emailed to you along with the link to the presentation. If you have any questions regarding the maths teaching at Lady Margaret, I will be happy to answer them, or please discuss with your child's class teacher. Thank you very much for attending.